Undertale, as you probably already know, was a game that came out late in 2015. It's received some pretty insane praise from critics, and it's already inserted itself as one of the highest rated PC games of all time. And look at all this content on YouTube. It's become impossible to avoid. A lot of people have their guard up when it comes to Undertale. Content creators put spoiler warnings everywhere, and the fanbase has exploded so hard that it's even become popular to hate the game. So why is Undertale getting so much attention? I mean, just look at it. It just looks like an indie game on the surface. What is it that Undertale did to be considered on par or even superior to these other great games that came out last year? To try and start answering these questions, I'd like to acknowledge that games are very subjective. You could have a very personal reason for liking or disliking Undertale, and if you've seen it and played it and you know you liked it, then I won't need to do much to convince you that the game is good. So instead, I'm going to be doing an analytical review on the basic elements that make up Undertale, looking at how it handles each element differently than other games, and how it uses these elements to better achieve its core narrative and theme. However, before I start, I want to clarify my position. When I first saw Undertale, like many of you, I had heard about it being a quirky RPG similar in vein to Earthbound, one of my favorite games when I was a child, which immediately put me on the defensive. I resented the comparison because what I saw seemed inferior. It looked as if it was borrowing Earthbound's gimmick entirely. I realized that I was being somewhat unfair, and I decided to buy the game anyways, if only to fart around and kill everyone, and it was after I played the game that I finally changed my mind. I think that Undertale is very deserving of a 10 out of 10 rating, and I don't mean that the game is absolutely perfect and replaces my need for breathing, no. To me, a 10 out of 10 game is something that succeeds in everything that it tries and excels beyond my expectations, and above that, the game does not get worse the more that I play it. And it gives me a deeper appreciation of the work that was put into it the more I analyze it. And that's exactly what Undertale did. It blew my expectations out of the water, and it reshaped the way I think about indie game development, and the clear advantages of having one man as the sole creative vision behind your game. I've got nothing but kind words for this man and how we're probably destined to be together. I'll be elaborating on that never, but first I want to give you the official spoiler warning, as from here on I will be referencing sections of the game from all playthroughs with reckless abandon. And while this timer is counting down, I want to quickly mention that even though I'm some goon who thinks that music spoilers are a thing, I don't think that you could truly spoil Undertale. The emergent gameplay and your own personal interactions with the characters comes almost exclusively with playing the game, so I don't think that it's necessary to hunt people down in the comment section if they accidentally spoil something. So with that, I'll start by talking about the first aspect of Undertale that people probably noticed right off the bat: the graphics. I think that without much effort, you could easily make the argument that the visuals are the weakest element of the game. That being said, it's clear that Toby Fox didn't really sink a whole lot of eggs into this basket, and I'd assume that even if he did end up having a larger budget for his game, the graphics probably wouldn't have changed too drastically. I'm not saying that I personally hate the graphics, I think that they're very effective for what they are. So what do the graphics accomplish for the game? Well, for one, it's charming as shit. It's got that indie aesthetic to it, but it's also clearly got its own style that makes it immediately identifiable. And goddamn, look at all the merchandise this game spawned. This point isn't important into figuring out why Undertale is such a good game, but it is a bullet point worth mentioning when you're talking about indie games. Very rarely with an indie game's budget can you really wow people with how intense and realistic your graphics are. So to combat this, most indie game developers try to develop a unique graphical style. And to do this, they often imitate this retro style sort of graphics. It's cheap and easy, not very difficult creatively speaking either. So it's good to see that at the very least, Undertale's graphical style is distinctive enough that you would probably be able to pick out the Undertale characters from a line of other retro-style indie game characters. But that's what Undertale simply does well. Where I think that the graphics excel is in the combat sections. Separating what you see in the overworld and in the combat sections was kind of brilliant, and I personally love the design of a whole bunch of the monsters, with a couple that clearly stand out. The stark differences in the two graphical styles really lends itself to the gameplay by establishing what it is you expect to see when a fight starts, and what a standard fight should look like. Because there's this general rule established, it then allows for the game to go ahead and change what it is you are used to seeing, breaking the rule and instantly creating this distinct and memorable moment. These moments where things change are going to play a major part in this review, so keep that in mind as we move on to the next section, which is probably the number one thing you're going to hear Undertale praised for: the writing. The common abbreviation that you hear people attempt to describe Undertale with goes something like, it's a quirky RPG similar to Earthbound, or some variation of that. At least that's how I heard it. Anyways, I mentioned earlier that I originally resented the game because of this comparison to Earthbound, one of my all-time favorite games. And yeah, I think it's fair to compare the humor to Earthbound. They both toy with the player's expectations of video games and RPG tropes, and they both got the wacky zany characters. However, I got the impression that what people refer to when they say that this game is like Earthbound, that they were referring to the mixture of dark themes with the humor. This assumption I made is why I immediately disliked Undertale, because even at a glance I could tell that each handled the mixing of these elements very differently. So I want to talk a bit how Undertale and Earthbound each handled their darker sections. I'll use the analogy of dropping a frog into boiling water versus turning up the temperature slowly. What Earthbound did to its players is a bit more subtle. It established its weird tone right from the opening, having it set at nighttime with you running out of the house into like this police investigation, and then the music was weird, and eventually you meet an alien. But in no time, it had you running around beating up dogs with baseball bats and eating burgers out of the trash. The game kind of subverts the idea that it's going to get any weirder than it already had, until it does, several times, gradually over the course of the whole game. However, Undertale establishes right off the bat that it's gonna fuck with you, and while the game similarly leaves you alone for almost the entire midsection of the game, you never really forget what it did to you, and that affects how you react at the end of the game. Yo, the fuck? Oh, I guess we're doing this now. I fucking hate this flower, dude! Oh, I guess we're doing this now. Oh! Ow! Anyways, I hope that I didn't imply that Undertale handled this worse, because it didn't. After I thought about it, both games have achieved something with their writing that was complementary to the length of their game. Undertale is a game that lasts about, 6 hours, according to this website? That's not a whole lot of time to work with when you're trying to make a story with a lasting impact. So Undertale couldn't be subtle when it was attempting to consistently surprise its players. Because Earthbound was a longer game, it could afford to pepper in the dark moments throughout the entire length of the game, which made those moments stick out because they were so different from the rest of the game. But if you took all those moments and tried to condense them to fit into an Undertale playthrough, the player would become numb to it. You would be walking through a hallway just waiting for the next jump scare or whatever, and ultimately it would lose all of its impact. So instead, Undertale only has a few of these moments, starting with the opening of the game and another at each of the different endings, and those endings work out really well. So the question is then, how did Undertale create such an impactful ending in such a short period of time? And the answer is, it's because of all the little details. Everything in the game's writing is helping you to attach yourself to the story more and more. The funny characters, the spastic humor, and all the clever writing. I'll focus on two for now, the characters and the cleverness, as they sort of go hand in hand. I personally found it very difficult to hate any of the characters in this game. I tried to on my first playthrough and I failed. And I'd wager that if you did dislike the characters, you probably didn't care too much for the game either. It's seriously rare to have a game like Undertale where instead of figuring out which characters you liked and which you didn't, you just end up creating this descending list in your head of who you liked more. I'm not going to focus on the individual characters. Instead, I want to talk about the tactics used to make the characters seem more realistic. Undertale is one of the few games that has lines of dialogue that will catch you completely off guard. A lot of these are due to the game constantly updating itself with what it is that you're doing, such as Flowey calling you out on your bullshit when you try to reset your game after killing Toriel. But in a lot of cases, this is just the game's creator predicting what it is the player is going to do, and giving appropriate dialogue to the characters. It happens so often it's kind of freaky. This is what reviewers mean when they say that Undertale has clever writing. If you try to fuck with the game, Toby fucks with you right back. Having the game do this constantly is forcing the players to engage themselves with the story. Players either put their guard up, or in some cases, they'll just go out of the way to experiment with all the possible reactions that they can get. And a lot of the entertainment from the game comes from encountering new characters and seeing how they're going to react to your decisions. Each time that the game can successfully engage you like this, whether it's able to make you laugh, or it's able to get you hyped, it gets you more attached to the characters. This is so much more than just having that polished feel to the dialogue, as it's crucial to creating the impact during the final parts of the game. Seriously, try to imagine how much the ending just wouldn't fucking matter if you managed to make it through the whole game and you didn't care about any of the characters. That's why it's so impressive that Undertale managed to achieve this with its characters in like a fifth of the time that other RPGs have. Alright, so the characters are great, but there's another aspect to the writing that I think is really interesting, and I think it creates a lot of the replayability for the game. I think it's something that you would call the metafiction, or meta-writing. If I got that wrong, please don't crucify me too hard, as I'm gonna try to attempt to explain what I mean. The meta that I am referring in Undertale is how the story is written to transcend the game's universe. I'm not talking about the fourth wall breaks, which the game does a lot. I'm specifically talking about the sections of the story that reference the player as a character, as well as saving and resetting being a key plot element. The best examples of what I mean about the player being a part of the story happens right at the end of the genocide route. Flowey essentially gives you his entire side of the story. He explains that before the human arrived, it was him who had the power to save and reset. He also somewhat unsubtly explains what the charm of Undertale is, becoming friends with everyone, killing everyone, just to see what their reaction is going to be. Flowey acknowledges that there is something else with them. The player is watching, and he wants the player to feel just as guilty as they are for letting all of this happen. Your determination is what stole the power to save and reset from Flowey, which is explored in more depth during your fight with Sans. He explains that they detected an anomaly, and new timelines were popping up left and right. This anomaly is you, the player. And the timelines are referring to any number of possible endings that you were able to achieve that Flowey could not. You and your determination are the only things that are capable of both destroying everything or saving everyone. This relationship between the game and the player ends up developing into one of the most interesting motivations I've ever seen for a villain character. The game gives you enough information that you can assume that Flowey was once Asgore's and Toriel's son, Asriel, who makes his return as the game's final boss. He plainly states that he can never let you win, because if you can manage to achieve a happy ending, then you will stop playing with him. The dialogue could be interpreted as being directed towards the fallen human, but it's more likely a taunt towards the player, trying to establish Asriel as being aware of his own veil, and that without the player there to continue playing Undertale, he will cease to exist. He has to win. If he doesn't, everything will come to an end. When you win the fight, you save Asriel's and everyone's soul, but only long enough for him to destroy the barrier before he has to leave again. And if that wasn't heavy enough for you, those of you who opened the game again after achieving the true ending got to read this brutal shit. Gotta take a breather after that one. Just before I move on from the writing, I want to quickly talk about the references that are used in Undertale. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of references in games. It's because the majority of games just slap in some annoying and immersion-breaking shit that takes me right out of the experience. Like a character will just say some meme in the middle of their dialogue, no matter how important it was, and I just get slapped awake. I'm forced to remember, oh fuck, that's right, I'm just some fat kid playing video games. I almost forgot that the internet existed. So I think that it's worth mentioning that Undertale handles its references way smarter than those games. A lot of the references are just off to the side. They're there for you to spot and be like, oh hey, aren't those the medals that the Starman wears? But besides those references, there are also the really creative ones which transform the original context, and they sort of aid Undertale in becoming this parody of the RPG genre. Finally done with the writing. It's time to move on to my favorite part of any video game. It's time to move on to my favorite part of any video game, the music. This may seem like a smaller deal to some of you, but I swear a good soundtrack is all that you need to make a game memorable. I could make a whole video just bitching about modern video games and how I have to constantly go into the options just to turn up the music that you paid an entire orchestra to develop. It's so bizarrely different compared to what I was used to when I was a kid. So Undertale has a great soundtrack, and somehow it's managed to become just as nostalgic to listen to as all my other favorite video game soundtracks from when I was a kid. There were two things in particular that Toby Fox did with the soundtrack that made me personally love it. The first was the use of sound fonts from other games, especially Earthbound in my case. The moment I heard those songs that used the Earthbound sound font made my hair stand up. Especially for the song Amalgam, which is an appropriately named amalgamation of samples from The Place in Earthbound. I ended up buying the soundtrack when I got to the Metaton X fight, because by then I had seen how well the Undertale uses its music. The game has a whole bunch of leitmotifs that you can encounter right from the start of the game. Leitmotifs, for those of you who don't know, are the reoccurring melodies that you hear throughout a piece of work. Whole characters in the game have their own sets of songs which play as their theme, and each progress creating this natural build-up which eventually pays off when you hear the last song that's used during their final encounter. It creates this immediate nostalgia, which brings you back to the memories of meeting that character and the first time that you heard their theme. There's already a whole bunch of videos out there which point out all these different leitmotifs inside of Undertale. I'll link a few in the description. I definitely recommend checking them out. So there's a build-up present in the music of Undertale. But first, I want to quickly talk about dynamic music in video games, as it has to do with how Undertale uses this build-up. Dynamic music, by its Wikipedia definition, is where specific events in a video game cause the background music to change. This doesn't mean the difference between the song that was used in level 1 and the song that was used in level 2. No, there is a difference. I'll show you, but specifically I'll show you how Undertale uses dynamic music to enhance the important moments in the game. There are a few examples of this, but the very best examples are during the Omega Flowey and the Azrael Dreamer boss fights. So Omega Flowey is this crazy and hectic battle. But during the fight, there are these few moments which break up the non-stop onslaught you are trying to endure. It's easily noticeable. The music for these sections change in order to better match what it is you're currently seeing on screen. But on top of that, did you ever notice that the speed of the battle almost seems to match the beat of the music? What I mean is that the music is this insane and over-the-top melody, and at the same time it's throwing this completely unreasonable amount of shit at you that you can't even be expected to dodge. But if you endure for long enough, the music becomes somber, and you are given this moment to heal up, and eventually even a chance to counterattack. Flowey's defenses have lowered, and now he is actually taking damage. His attacks slow down to a point where you can now be expected to dodge them, matching the new and less chaotic melody. You can easily witness this same change during Azrael's fight, as it starts off very plainly as it's making a callback to the fight with Toriel. The battle simply states that it's the end, when suddenly the music comes crashing in and the background explodes, immediately interrupting anything that Azrael was doing, and then the game tells you that the true final battle is beginning. You can now start to see how every aspect of the game is coming together to try and create these intense and memorable moments. So to continue that thought, let's move on to the last section. The gameplay, and how everything adds up to create the narrative. What is there to say in terms of gameplay? Well, it's a bullet hell game, you can attack, and there are some dialogue options. Pretty simple stuff, really. Well, kind of. While Undertale doesn't have in complexity in terms of gameplay, it makes up for in variety. The game is constantly throwing new gimmicks at the player to overcome in order to progress the game, ensuring that each boss fight is something entirely different. While I originally hated the idea of a game that is essentially changing its rules on you constantly, after a while I began to see how this plays into the theme of determination. The character and you are both forced into unexpected situations, and in order to persevere you must adapt and overcome them. And even if that results in your failure, the game continues to remind you to stay determined. The truly neat feature about Undertale's combat is how it's driven by each battle's own unique dialogue. So on a pacifist run of the game, you end combat by either running away, attacking your enemies without killing them, which is a risky option and most people try to avoid, or by sparing your enemies. In order to spare your enemy, the game makes you analyze what it is the enemy is doing and saying in order for you to pick the right dialogue options. Because of this, each enemy feels unique, not only in their attack patterns, but in their character and how you interact with them in order to end combat peacefully. And this plays into another strength that the game has, and that's its ability to tell a story through its combat sections. In standard RPGs, you'll generally have your dialogue and cutscenes separate from combat. You'll get a character who will just before fighting explain why it is they must stop you, and then you fight them. They sometimes say a line right at the end of combat if they are important enough, and then they die. The end. But in Undertale, dialogue and combat happens at the same time, and some of the most meaningful character arcs happen during the middle of combat. This is easily observable in any of the boss encounters, but I feel like it was done best for Mettaton. Just prior to the fight, as a character, Mettaton was just an evil, albeit quirky, human killing machine. He does have his own character traits, and he has had some pretty memorable moments up until now, but his motivation seems pretty clear. He is programmed to kill you because he's an evil robot. However, the game has secretly been working towards a dramatic final confrontation with Mettaton, and just before combat, he gives you some much needed insight on Dr. Alphys, which sort of contradicts Mettaton's character up until now, as he is exercising some level of autonomy outside of his programming. As you battle with him, you not only push him to change his forms physically, but he also eventually is brought to a point where he plainly states what his primary motivation has been this whole time. And it all makes sense. He's not actually all that bad, and he, like a lot of the other characters that you encounter, have this misguided conception of what is necessary in order to achieve a greater good. And by battling with him, you help him to reach some sort of breakthrough. If you think about it outside of the game's mechanics, this is kind of what the fallen human's ability is. Staying determined in the face of danger while saving everyone that they meet. In the music section, I talked about how the speed of certain battles lines up with the music in order to create this more intense and memorable moment. But the gameplay also helps with this as well. Did you ever notice, during your battle with Asgore, that your health dropped to 1 by the end of one of his attacks? 1 HP, man, you barely survived that. You must have got super lucky. Or did you? So just before you fight Asgore, you are given the Worn Dagger and the Heart Locket, the final equipment of the game. With the Heart Locket equipped, Asgore's attacks will always be hitting you for 5 damage. And on a pacifist run, that means that you're going to be dead in just 4 hits. So how then would your health ever drop to 1? Well, it's possible because the game is saving your life. It's giving you an extra hit so that you can look at your health bar and you can realize just how difficult the boss you are facing is. And I mean that even at 2 health with an inferior armor item, his next attack will always bring you down to 1. Obviously, it would be actually harder if he just killed you in just 4 hits, but by doing it this way, the fight feels harder, and it fills you with more determination to win. Because this element ties so well with the theme of the game, I think they saved it for only the most important fights. You may have noticed the same thing happening during the Omega Flowey fight, even if it was just out of the corner of your eye. During the fight, you don't even have a number for your health. You're just forced to put your trust in this little yellow bar. And his hits just completely chunk you for damage. But man, there's so much happening you could barely even pay attention. Except, oh wow, that last bit of health is really going a long way. It's not like these bosses can't kill you, but by displaying your health in this way, it sort of artificially adds tension to the fight, and it works super well. Even with me knowing how this works, it doesn't stop the Omega Flowey fight from being super stressful for me, and every time I beat him it feels like I went through an ordeal. It's the small details like these that go such a long way, and it's why Undertale is so good at making you feel the way it wants you to feel, and why it's such a good game. So in conclusion, when it comes down to it, the reason why people love Undertale so much is because of the lasting effect it had on them. The moments are powerful, interesting, and entertaining, and even though it's such a small game by comparison to others of the genre, it packs so many more of these moments that other longer games have. It's short and sweet. If I could go on longer, I'd love to gush about how diverse the different emotional impacts this game has to offer, from the polar differences between the pacifist and genocide routes, how hype and motivating one is and how the other one makes you feel like a piece of human fucking garbage, or how fucking creepy this shit is. Like, holy fuck, dude. Hopefully by now, if you're someone who still doesn't see why Undertale could be considered a 10 out of 10 game, then hopefully you can at least respect the amount of work and care that went into it. And there's still so much more that me and everybody else who's talked about Undertale still hasn't articulated that can make up another 10 episodes of Did You Know Gaming, or, you know, any of these. But seriously, I hope that if you stuck it out this long that you at least enjoyed the video, and hopefully you learned something new. With the amount of content that there is out there for this game, it's hard to tell what people have already talked about, so I hope that this has at least had some meaningful insight. If you haven't played the game already, I seriously urge you to buy it. Trust me, there is a big difference between watching the game and playing it. This man worked his ass off for your $10, so if you want to help him out a bit, why not splurge a bit and buy a shirt? Maybe we can look forward to another game like this in the future. And seriously, thank you for watching.